The Wisconsin teen accused of killing his parents in a plot to kill President Trump has entered a plea of not guilty. Nikita Casap, chained up in a jail jumpsuit, was back in court this week, and we're learning more about the alleged twisted plans that he had to overthrow the US government and escape to Ukraine, why allegedly executing his parents was part of that plan. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Not guilty. That is the plea that 17-year-old Nikita Casap entered in court this week. This is a case that we have been following from really the very beginning, but it has taken so many twists, so many turns. It has become even more shocking than what is already an incredibly disturbing case, to the point where it involves the White House and the FBI is investigating. Here is Nikita Casap, 17 years old, entering a courtroom in Wisconsin this week for his arraignment. Now, let's get you caught up to speed about how we got to this point. On February 28th, police found Nikita's mom and stepdad dead inside their home in Waukesha, Wisconsin. That's not far from Milwaukee. This is a picture of the couple. Don Meyer on the left, the stepdad, and Tatiana Casap, that is Nikita's biological mom, on the right. Right now, Nikita is facing 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of hiding a corpse, among other charges. And we just heard his attorney in court say he is pleading not guilty to all of them.
He's entering a not guilty plea.
A teenager who was won Student of the Month at his high school, accused of killing his parents, that is without question a shocking story. But at this point in the story, it was about to go to a whole new level, a level where the FBI would be involved, a shadowy figure in Russia who Nikita Casap was allegedly speaking to, and even President Trump. Here's the house where the murders allegedly happened. This is where Don, Tatiana, and Nikita lived in Waukesha, and you can see this is in a really nice neighborhood. It's a really nice house. Police went here on February 28th because they had received a call from Don's mom. She told police that her son had sent text messages that she found weird earlier that week on February 23rd. And she said that Don had texted another family member that he felt sick and that he was going to take time off social media. Around the same time, police also received a call from Nikita Casap's high school that he hadn't shown up for 2 weeks. Up until that point, he had perfect attendance on the year. So it was definitely what seemed to be out of character for him, and they wanted a wellness check. When police arrived at that house, they found Don shot in the head and Tatiana shot dead as well. Both of their bodies were covered in blankets and they were in separate rooms. The big question at that point for investigators was, where was Tatiana's 17-year-old son, Nikita? A neighbor told police they saw him driving away in his stepdad's VW Atlas roughly 5 days earlier. Nikita didn't have a driver's license, so that was certainly a red flag. Police then pinged Don and Tatiana's phones, and they showed up 15 hours away in Wyoming. As far as Nikita's phone, the ping for that showed up in Iowa, specifically at the world's largest truck stop, which is 11 hours from where his parents' phone showed up in Laramie, Wyoming. Police checked surveillance video at that truck stop, and there they saw Nikita, his stepdad's car, and the family dog.
Is your last name pronounced Casap?
Casap.
Casap? Okay.
Casap was eventually arrested in Kansas, then after that extradition hearing was sent back to Wisconsin to face charges. Family violence is incredibly tragic and shocking, but again, this story was really just getting started at this point. Inside Don Meyer's car, police found a gun that was missing from the home that allegedly matched the kind that was used in the shooting, as well as electronics and an SD card. Police say on that SD card, they found videos from inside the Waukesha house. And those videos allegedly showed Nikita Casap lighting candles around his stepdad's dead body, seemingly trying to cover the scent as it laid there for days. I want to take a moment and talk about the reality that many of the stories you see here on Law&Crime prove that life can be unpredictable, and having a great attorney matters. And that's where our partners at Morgan & Morgan come in. This is a law firm with more than 1,000 attorneys and a history of winning. Just in the last few months, they were able to secure a $9.3 million verdict. That was for a car crash in Florida, a $5.6 million verdict for a car accident in Atlanta, and $1.8 million in Kentucky. And in that case, the insurance company was only going to offer $5,000. So even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy to file a claim. You can do it with just 8 easy clicks on your phone. So if you're hurt, go to forthepeople.com/OTC. You can also use the link in the description of this video or scan the QR code on your screen. Police think Don and Tatiana were killed on February 11th, meaning Nikita likely lived in that house with their bodies for nearly 2 weeks until their neighbor saw him leave on February 23rd. In the recorded video, police say Nikita also seemed to be holding a phone to Don's body to show someone what he had allegedly done. Now, why would a teen who not only had perfect attendance, but was also one student of the month in his high school allegedly do this? That is still a question that hasn't been answered, but we are learning some clues. But I will tell you, I was not expecting what police would then say in the court documents that we read through. Casap allegedly killed his parents to get financial means to kill President Trump, overthrow the US government, and commit several terrorist attacks. The Waukesha County Sheriff's Office looked through Casap's phone and reportedly found disturbing conversations in Russian with people on TikTok and the platform Telegram, which bills itself as a place for free speech, but is controversial because of alleged criminal activity that can be on it. The FBI says Casap had material on his phone related to the Order of the Nine Angles, which the agency says is a network of people with neo-Nazi, racially motivated extremist views. The group advocates for the use of violence and terrorism to overthrow governments and destroy modern civilization. And groups like this seem to be a growing problem for the FBI. Just this week, the agency told ABC News that they're working 250 investigations of a loose network of violent predators that befriend teens and then reportedly convince them to commit sexual and violent behavior. That group is called 764, and The Guardian reports that that group is an offshoot of the Order of the Nine Angles. A massive mystery within this story is the question of who was Nikita Casap communicating with in Russian on social media. Here's what we know. The warrant says between February 14th and 24th, the days after Casap allegedly killed his parents, he was living with their bodies in the house, and he had messages on Telegram in Russian that said, quote, reply to them all and say you got sick, and quote, drag them to the basement. Now remember, at the beginning, Don's mom called the police in part because of some of the odd text messages she said she received from her son. And based on the timeline from investigators, those texts were sent after Don and Tatiana were killed. Another shocking revelation in this story is the FBI apparently already had contact with the Casap family in 2023. We still don't know a lot about that meeting, but we do know that federal agents talked to Nikita's family in November that year. In the newly unsealed document, agents say that Nikita Casap, who went by the username Awoken on TikTok, had conversations with someone else about that racist ideology, the Order of the Nine Angles. This was in December of last year, roughly 2 months before his parents were murdered. Now, he tells another user that he talked to a girl about the ideology and she was, quote, pretty chill about it. And he said if his parents were to find out, quote, they would take away my phone away if they did, especially since FBI visited LOL. Authorities also found Casap talked on Telegram under the username Accelerationist, and on January 21st, less than a month before his parents were killed, he was allegedly talking to someone about a terror attack, asking, quote, what country do you think will get the blame for this? With an unknown user replying, Russia will be blamed for it. This is the goal. Nikita then allegedly goes on to say, quote, when the time comes for me to send my manifesto to you so you can spread it online, should it be PDF? And also, won't anyhow change or modify the manifesto. The FBI says they found a manifesto. It was 3 pages long and talks about killing the President of the United States to create a political revolution and to, quote, save the white race from, quote, Jewish-controlled politicians, with the final page having images and words praising Adolf Hitler. The FBI only included excerpts from that alleged manifesto, but it does appear Casap was definitely focused on President Trump. He writes, quote, "As to why specifically Trump, I think it's obvious. By getting rid of the president and perhaps the vice president, that is guaranteed to bring in some chaos. And not only that, but it will further bring into the public the idea that assassinations and accelerating the collapse are possible things to do." Casap would later allegedly write, quote, "As a side note, the other attacks that may occur, what they are/who they target, I have no idea, even if they are same ideology as I. Point being, this manifesto is specifically for the attack that targets Trump." A key piece of evidence in this case is going to be the sheer amount of money and jewelry found with Nikita Casap when he was arrested in Kansas. He allegedly had a pried open safe, women's jewelry, $14,000 in cash, and banking documents. It appears Casap wanted to use that money, which he was able to obtain by allegedly killing his parents, to buy a drone that he would use in a terror attack. In another Telegram conversation, Casap speaks with user, quote, "Angel of Death," about a drone with a dropping mechanism. Casap allegedly asks about caring for a drone, and the user tells him that the amount would cost between $1,200 and $1,500. They also allegedly talk about an IED, or improvised explosive device. Casap also allegedly asked for headphones that could protect his ears from the sound of a .357 Magnum. That is the gun he allegedly used to kill his mom and stepdad. It's important to note that Casap allegedly talks about paying in Bitcoin because in previous court appearances, state prosecutors say he stopped at a Bitcoin vending machine on his multi-state drive after allegedly killing his parents. Now, as far as why Nikita Casap drove west from Wisconsin after allegedly killing his parents, a lot of that may have to do with the communication he was having with someone overseas. Casap also allegedly spoke with someone who writes in an Eastern European dialect that gave him coordinates to drive from southwest Wyoming through Kansas to a location near Oklahoma. And Casap allegedly asks, quote, "Then from there to Eureka, California, is it 30 hours? You think I'll have enough time?" Casap allegedly asked questions like, "How long will I need to hide before I will be moved to Ukraine? And also, I probably should brush up on my Russian because I can understand just fine, but speaking is harder. So while in Ukraine, I will get a normal job and have a normal life, even when it's found out what I did. Do the 10 other people have similar beliefs to I, or are they different?" There's also a message that is cut off that says, "Assuming that my parents won't leave." Again, we don't know what the rest of that sentence would have said. The 10 other people part is notable because deputies in Wisconsin spoke with a female classmate of Casap's at Waukesha West High School, where he was once student of the month, who said that Casap told her about his alleged plan, saying that if they saw 10 consecutive attacks in the news, it would have been him. The witness also told authorities that Casap talked about being in contact with a man in Russia about overthrowing the US government, and he intended to kill his parents by shooting them, but didn't have access to a gun. She said Casap regularly sent her what he called gore edits that were videos with Russian music on Snapchat that flashed gory war images. Prior to the newly released federal search warrant, we knew that Casap allegedly talked to his classmate about his desire to allegedly kill President Trump and that he had an obsession with fascism and Adolf Hitler. But this is the first time that we heard that authorities believed that this was the alleged motive in the deaths of Tatiana Casap and Don Meyer. And it is also the most detailed timeline to this point of the lengths that Nikita Casap allegedly went to be part of what he thought was a large plan to commit mass terror in the United States. Joining us now to talk more about this case is former FBI and CIA agent Tracy Walder. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. Nikita Casap, apparently he sympathized or liked this ideology called Order of the Nine Angles. What do we know about some of the ideology that he seemed to follow online?
I would say the Order of the Nine Angles, for the most part, seems to be a lot about white supremacy, white nationalism, sort of that, I guess, alt-right movement, if you will, very much about really wanting to start a political civil war, strangely, in this country, between both sides, actually, of the political aisle. And by creating this civil war, their hope is that this white nationalist ideology will then become the supreme ideology.
And with that, because I look at this case and you have this teenager who was somewhat radicalized on social media, talking with someone in Russian, and it feels like there could be parallels drawn to some of the ISIS-inspired attacks that we've seen around the world with young men who end up being radicalized by someone on social media. What have we learned in kind of fighting that front that maybe could be applied to cases like this that we see with young men on social media, and they seem to follow the ideology of someone like Nikita Casap apparently did in this case?
Well, it's interesting because we've actually had two more instances since this of this occurring. You have an individual who was actually just arrested in Iraq for participating in the radicalization of the person responsible for the New Orleans attacks on New Year's Day. And then you actually have the Lady Gaga concert. That
Yeah.
attack was recently thwarted by a very similar ideology. This group also was trying to primarily prey upon older teenagers, so 17, 18, 19-year-old crowd, men in particular, like you mentioned, and it's that nationalist ideology. They happen to be anti-LGBTQ. So you are right, we're sort of seeing this uptick in this. Right now, the critical thing in this, and it's what I suspected actually stopped the Taylor Swift attack, which was a similar radicalization, is the sharing of intelligence. I know that sounds oversimplified, but I cannot stress it enough because different countries and different intelligence agencies have different ways of collecting this. And when we share that with each other and have good relationships with these countries and pass that to them in real time, we can actually stop these attacks, because these lone wolf attacks, which is really what they are, can be like looking for a needle in a haystack.
When you look at this case, and he was talking to someone in Russian, he had plans to try and get to Ukraine. I don't know if we'll ever know who he was talking to, but who do you think was on the other side of these chats he was having online?
That's a really good question. I don't think it was a Ukrainian necessarily. I actually think it was probably a Russian. We know this simply because, just from the CIA perspective, the Russians are pretty notorious for trying to sow seeds of particularly political discontent in the United States. They have done that for decades, really since the inception of the Cold War. The Chinese are different. They're more looking for trade secrets. The Russians have always tried really to sow these seeds of political discontent. So to me, this really tells me it's probably a Russian. I don't think it's a member of a Russian intelligence service. I think it is probably a member of one of these groups who really wants to do this in the US.
What's some of the differences you see that would make you believe that, as opposed to someone who would work for the government of Russia trying to sow some political divide?
That's a good question too. Typically, again, I'm just speaking in broad strokes because I'm speaking
Sure.
from sort of high level CIA stuff, if you will. What we see behaviorally from the Russians is, if it's the FSB, right, which is their CIA conducting this, it tends to be broader scale. So you're looking at things like critical infrastructure attacks, large scale taking down of government websites, those kinds of things, because there's just so many more people, right, that are capable of doing that. Whereas we see with these, it's these sort of one-offs. And so that's what really triggers me to think that this is a, I don't want to say just one person, but a probably very small group that may not be associated with the government.
We've learned a little bit more since the last time we spoke about this, of some of the pieces of information that Nikita Casap apparently had with him when he was arrested. You have these SD cards that showed his parents' bodies covered in blankets, and I mean, it's absolutely horrific. But he also had a lot of money with him. He had some jewelry with him. It seems like he thought that he was going to be able to allegedly commit this crime, killing his parents, and then flee to another country. But from an investigative standpoint, what are some of the mistakes that he made along the way that allowed law enforcement to not just arrest him, but also uncover all these other pieces of information as they build their case against him for murder?
I mean, I honestly think he probably watches too many James Bond movies and too many Mission Impossible movies, and truly thought that he could kind of leave this wake of destruction, right? That you're mentioning. The money he had, I'm understanding, was to obtain additional passports or fake passports. I could be wrong, but that's what I thought I had read. And so for him to think that he would be able to transit through an airport using the same passport that he had, because he didn't even have the fake passports yet, is is very surprising. Also, leaving in that same vehicle, he took the family dog with him as well that he would probably have to take care of along the way. Also, the fact that he stayed in the home for a couple of weeks afterwards and built all of that concern and speculation as to where the parents may be really allowed people to almost get a head start in terms of who a suspect would be in this case.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a pretty strong case against him, and he just pleaded not guilty. Going back, because I think for a lot of people, it's just so terrifying that someone who, to that point, he had perfect attendance in school, he was student of the month at one point, and then how do you get to the point where you're alleged to have done what he's done? But when it comes to radicalization online, in your experience, what is the moment that someone goes from maybe having an interest in stuff that's gory, and that's not necessarily new for young people, to then get to the point where you would actually do something like this after communicating with someone overseas?
I think there's really two things, in my opinion, that really tip the scales. I think the first is they want to feel like they are making a bigger impact than what they are doing. I want to go so far as to say they almost feel bored in the current cycle of life that they are in. And this gives them an opportunity to, I guess, act out that fantasy. Also, you're right. On the surface, it did seem like he had a normal childhood. There wasn't any deviant things that are readily available to us. But typically, in 99% of these cases, what we see is something happening in the person's life that they feel is catastrophic, and that they feel then marginalizes them, and they can't be a member of this community. In the New Orleans attack, it was him losing his family and his home when he had a seemingly normal life. And so those are things that we may not know of now, or it was something very, very small that none of us think is necessarily a big deal, but he catastrophized it to the point that he felt that this is what he needed to do to get out.
He was communicating with this person in Russian on Telegram.
Mhm.
That app, I know it's, free speech is kind of what it says it's all about. But in your experience, what are some of why is it it seems a breeding ground in cases like this? Because it does come up a lot in these types of cases.
You are so right. Telegram is really a thorn in the side, to be honest with you, of the intelligence community, of the law enforcement community, because it is it's the equivalent, if people know, of 4chan, which was where a lot of radicalization was happening prior, really to Telegram taking off. 4chan has sort of calmed down. Um, Yes, obviously there is the right to free speech, but this is becoming a place for radicalization where people are then taking those conversations from Telegram and then moving them into the dark web, which makes it really difficult, obviously, for people to see. But the good news is the FBI is able to monitor Telegram as well as the CIA, and they can get tips off of that. We also know, too, I guess back to the Russians, that they are paying some of these smaller groups that are not associated with the government to go on Telegram and to radicalize individuals. And so those are being targeted as well from basically the opposite side, whether, it's not from the Telegram out, but rather from the country into Telegram.
And I know in some cases, and recently we did a story on a sex offender, and the police ended up reaching out to Meta to get information because there were conversations on Instagram. When it comes to Telegram, how cooperative is that company with law enforcement in a case like this where you have someone who was apparently and allegedly planning out the murder of his parents and then escaping on social media?
Well, they're cooperative in the sense that we know that these conversations were had, so clearly they've turned them over. They've probably turned them over because law enforcement has obtained a warrant. They don't have a choice in that matter. But I guess to counter that point a little bit, it's quite difficult if you look at, gosh, maybe this was 10, 15 years ago, the San Bernardino shooter. We thought that there was
Yeah.
still a threat, and Apple refused to turn over that passcode to the individual's phone so that we could see if there was still an imminent threat. So Meta, Telegram, Apple, all of them are helpful when presented with a warrant. But prior to that, there's not much information you're going to get from them because they are private companies. They pride themselves on privacy, and they're not going to hand that over.
And as far as I think for a lot of parents, you look at this case, you never think that your child is going to be someone who's in Nikita Casap's situation, but there's always been that concern of who your child could be talking to when they're on social media. How new, though, is it something like this, where they could potentially be radicalized? And I don't think teenagers being interested in gore is anything new, but then to have this happen, how new is that? And how, from your time in the FBI and the CIA, I mean, is this something that's different than maybe what you've seen in the past?
In my opinion, actually, no. And let me tell you why. I think a lot of it is really with the advent of actually ISIS in 2010-ish or kind of late 2000s. They really were wildly recruiting and targeting through media, through digital means, individuals here in the US that were 17 and 18 years old. So I don't want to say they started it. Clearly, I am certain it existed before them, but that's when we started to see this really, I think, flourishing here. And then we saw it more so developing during COVID times, right? Where people were inside a lot and online a lot. So I wouldn't actually say that this is new. However, I don't know that parents realize how prevalent it is and how easy it is. I think a lot of parents assume your child has to be on one of these dark web channels or Telegram or something like that. And that's not typically how the initial contact starts. The initial contact starts through really basic social media channels, and then it's moved on to those platforms. And I think that's where the misconception is coming from.
And then just lastly, because I think a big part of this is for parents looking at this story, and how do you know what your kid is doing online? I remember growing up, you had the one family computer, but now a lot of people in their teenage years have cell phones, and that opens them up to the internet. I mean, how can parents truly monitor what their kids are doing on social media and who they're talking to?
You are so right. I'm so glad that you asked that question because I don't think we talk about it enough. I'm a parent, but my daughter does not have a cell phone yet. Listen, I am that mean parent and that my daughter will not have access to social media until she's 16, 17 years old. I think as parents, I don't judge, but we also have to be not afraid to be the enemy sometimes, right? And be that bad person or be the bad cop. But I also think too, taking your child's phone at night when they should be sleeping is not necessarily a bad idea because that's a lot of the times where they start to go down, these rabbit holes and then giving them back to them in the day. There's really small things that we can do. Obviously, I think people know that there's apps, right, that shut down certain sites remotely, but honestly, kids are a lot smarter than us and they know how to get around a lot of those. But I don't see anything wrong with checking your kid's phone, checking their search history, looking at what they're doing and looking through their apps.
Yeah, no, that's a really good piece of advice because I think that's a battle a lot of parents are fighting right now. I have young kids as well, and eventually I'm sure we'll be having those conversations one day. Former FBI and CIA agent Tracy Walder, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
During that court arraignment, the judge said that members of Don and Tatiana's families were listening in to the court hearing over Zoom. One family member wrote on social media about Don and Tatiana saying, quote, "Rest in the sweetest peace, my brother and sister-in-law. Taken much too soon, our memories do build a special bridge till we meet again." Nikita Casap is expected back in court August 18th for a status hearing. The judge says then they may talk about a date for a trial. For On the Case, presented by Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.